Picture 900 ghostly ribs of wood breaking the surface of a quiet river bend in Maryland, arranged like the skeleton of a beast too massive to name. Bald eagles nest in the rotting hulls. Fish swim through hallways where sailors once slept. And beneath the water, hidden in mud and silence, lies one of the strangest disposal operations in American history. A graveyard so large that for decades, mapmakers simply left it blank. You are looking at the wreckage of a government promise that came just a little too late, and a decision that turned a bay into a boneyard. What happened here was not a battle. It was something almost stranger. It was the story of what a nation does when it builds too much, too fast, for a war that ends before the ships even leave the dock. To understand why hundreds of vessels ended up rotting in the Chesapeake, you have to go back to a moment of pure desperation. German U-boats were tearing through Allied shipping lanes, sinking merchant vessels faster than shipyards could replace them. The United States government, faced with the terrifying possibility of losing the war at sea before American troops even reached the trenches, launched an emergency shipbuilding program unlike anything the world had seen. The Emergency Fleet Corporation was formed, and orders went out to shipyards across the country. Build wooden steamships, and build them now. Steel was needed for warships and weapons, so engineers turned to timber, an older technology dressed up in modern urgency. Contracts were signed for the construction of nearly 1,000 wooden-hulled steamers, ships designed not for grace or longevity, but for speed of production. Entire shipyards sprang up overnight along the coasts, employing tens of thousands of workers who had never built a ship in their lives. Wages were high, deadlines were brutal. The nation was told that these vessels would be the lifeline that kept Europe supplied and the war winnable. But here is the twist almost nobody remembers. Most of these ships were finished after the fighting had already stopped. The armistice came in November of 1918, and the shipyards kept building anyway, because contracts had already been signed and momentum does not stop on command. Ship after ship slid down the ways into the water, freshly painted, engines humming for the first time, built for a war that no longer existed. Imagine standing on the deck of a brand new steamship, commissioned for a global conflict, only to realize the conflict was already over. That is exactly what happened to hundreds of these vessels. Some never carried a single ton of cargo. Some never left the river they were built on. The government had spent staggering sums of money, hundreds of millions of dollars in wartime currency, on a fleet that arrived just after the emergency had passed. And here is where the real problem began. What do you do with an armada of wooden ships nobody needs? Steel-hulled vessels could be refitted, sold or repurposed for commercial trade. But these wooden ships were a different story. Rushed construction meant many were riddled with structural weaknesses. Green, unseasoned lumber had warped and cracked even before the ships saw open water. Maintenance costs were climbing every month they sat idle. The government tried to sell them. Shipping companies were not interested. Steel was the future, and wooden hulls were already viewed as relics from a bygone era, obsolete before their paint had even dried. Foreign buyers passed. Private investors passed. The ships sat, tied up in long, silent rows along the Potomac and the James River, costing the taxpayer money simply to exist. A fleet built to save a nation had become a fleet that nobody wanted, and the bill kept growing every single day it floated. The atmosphere inside government offices in Washington grew tense. Officials at the shipping board debated what to do with vessels that had already drained an almost unthinkable amount of public funds. Storage alone was consuming resources. Rot was spreading through the hulls faster than repairs could keep pace. Rats and mildew claimed the lower decks. Meanwhile, newspapers began quietly asking uncomfortable questions about where all that wartime money had actually gone and why ships built for victory were now simply rusting, or in this case, rotting, in place. The shipping board needed a solution, and it needed one that would not draw more embarrassing headlines. What happened next would turn out to be one of the most bizarre and least remembered decisions in American maritime history. In 1922, a private company called the Western Marine and Salvage Company purchased a huge portion of the surplus fleet at a fraction of its original cost, with one clear goal: strip them for scrap metal and burn away the rest. Picture rows of ships that had cost a fortune to build, sold off for pennies on the dollar because there was simply nothing else to do with them. The company set up an operation at a quiet, remote bend of the Potomac River near a place called Mallows Bay in Charles County, Maryland, chosen precisely because it was shallow, isolated, and far enough from prying eyes that the fires could burn without drawing too much public attention. What followed was one of the largest ship-burning operations in the history of the world. Tugboats hauled the wooden giants into the bay one by one. Salvage crews stripped away anything of value: brass fittings, copper wiring, engines, metal hardware, and then set the hollowed-out hulls ablaze to reach the iron nails and fasteners buried in the charred wood. Smoke rose over the Potomac for months. Locals watched from the shoreline as ship after ship burned down to the waterline and sank into the mud, their skeletons settling into the riverbed like the ribs of beached whales. The operation was supposed to be efficient. It was not. The scrap market collapsed shortly after the burning began, and Western Marine and Salvage went bankrupt before they could finish the job. Dozens of half-burned hulls were simply abandoned where they lay, left to rot in place, becoming part of the landscape rather than a completed demolition. The company meant to erase the fleet. Instead, they created a monument to it. But that wasn't the strangest part. Over the following decades, Mallows Bay quietly became a dumping ground for far more than wooden steamers. As the years passed and new conflicts came and went, other vessels were towed into the same quiet bend of river and left to sink. Old barges, retired dredges, a handful of vessels connected to the build-up and aftermath of the Second World War found their way into the same graveyard, drawn to a place that had already become an unofficial resting ground for anything the government no longer wanted to maintain. Officials discovered that Mallows Bay was simply easier, cheaper to abandon ships there than to properly dismantle or transport them elsewhere. What began as a single controversial salvage operation slowly grew into a decades-long habit, a place where obsolete vessels went to disappear, one quiet tow at a time, largely unnoticed by a public that had already moved on to new wars and new headlines. Nobody planned for Mallows Bay to become the largest shipwreck fleet in the Western Hemisphere. It just happened, one abandoned hull at a time. For decades, almost nobody spoke of what lay beneath the surface of that bend in the river. Locals knew, of course. Fishermen navigated around the wreckage, and children grew up hearing stories about the ghost ships hidden just beneath the waterline. But to the rest of the country, Mallows Bay was invisible, a footnote buried under the more dramatic memories of the world wars. Then, slowly, the wrecks began to reveal themselves in ways nobody expected. As the wooden hulls decayed and settled deeper into the mud, they created something extraordinary, an accidental ecosystem. Fish began spawning in the sheltered wreckage. Osprey and bald eagles built nests directly onto the rotting bows of ships that had once been built for war. Beavers moved into hollowed-out hulls. Turtles basked on curved wooden ribs that poked above the waterline like ancient driftwood sculptures. A graveyard built from wartime panic and bureaucratic failure had, without anyone intending it, become one of the richest wildlife habitats on the entire East Coast. Then came the discoveries nobody was expecting. Historians and marine archaeologists who began surveying the bay in the later 20th century realized they were not just looking at Emergency Fleet Corporation steamers. Tucked among the wrecks were older vessels entirely, a Revolutionary War-era longboat, remnants of Civil War period ships, and even barges believed to date back further still, layered on top of one another like sediment in a strange nautical timeline. Mallows Bay was not simply a World War graveyard. It was a graveyard of graveyards, a place where more than a century of America's discarded maritime history had quietly piled up in the same forgiving mud. Divers exploring the wrecks found personal items still lodged in the wood: bottles, tools, the occasional shoe, small fragments of the working lives of men who had built and sailed these ships, never imagining their vessels would end up as habitat for eagles instead of instruments of war. Government records from the original 1917 shipbuilding program only deepened the strangeness of the story. Some of the wooden steamers, historians found, had cost more per ton to build than steel-hulled ships of the same era, because the emergency program had driven up the price of lumber and skilled labor so dramatically. The nation had spent a fortune rushing to build ships that would end up worth more as firewood than as vessels. Congressional investigations after the war scrutinized the Emergency Fleet Corporation's spending, and while no single villain emerged, the program became a quiet cautionary tale whispered about in shipping and government circles for years afterward. Proof of what happens when wartime urgency collides with peacetime reality. The secrets hidden in Mallows Bay kept surfacing well into the modern era. Researchers uncovered evidence that several of the wooden steamers had, in a strange twist, been repurposed briefly before their final abandonment, converted into makeshift housing, floating storage, even, according to some local accounts, temporary fish processing platforms, before eventually being towed to their final resting place in the bay. Old aerial photographs from the mid-20th century show what looks like an ordinary stretch of river, giving no hint of the enormous fleet lying just beneath the surface, invisible from above at high tide. Local families who lived along the Potomac for generations passed down stories of swimming near the wrecks as children, of finding rusted machine parts washed up on the riverbank, entirely unaware that they were playing in the middle of what would later be recognized as one of the largest shipwreck concentrations on the planet. Perhaps the most remarkable secret of all is how close this entire chapter of history came to being erased completely. For much of the 20th century, there was serious discussion about dredging Mallows Bay clean, removing the wrecks entirely to open the waterway for development. Had those plans succeeded, one of the strangest and most important accidental monuments in American history would have vanished without a trace, disassembled and hauled away like nothing more than debris. That did not happen. Instead, something remarkable occurred. As awareness of the site grew in the 21st century, historians, environmentalists, and local communities began fighting to protect it rather than erase it. What had once been viewed as an embarrassing pile of wartime waste was reframed as an invaluable window into American industrial history, environmental resilience, and the unintended consequences of rapid militarization. In 2019, after years of advocacy, Mallows Bay was designated a national marine sanctuary by the United States government, officially recognizing it as a protected historical and ecological treasure. It became one of the few sanctuaries in the country centered not on coral reefs or open ocean, but on shipwrecks, a designation built specifically to protect a graveyard. Today, kayakers glide silently between the exposed ribs of century-old steamships. Researchers use sonar to map wrecks still hidden beneath the mud. School groups visit not to learn about a battle, but to learn about a mistake, and about what nature can do with the wreckage a mistake leaves behind. The legacy of Mallows Bay reaches far beyond Maryland. It stands today as one of the clearest lessons in the danger of wartime overproduction, a warning studied by economists and military planners about the risks of scaling industry faster than judgment can keep pace. It is echoed in later conflicts, too, in the mothballed fleets and surplus equipment auctions that followed the Second World War and the Cold War, moments when nations repeatedly discovered that winning, or ending, a war creates its own strange logistical battlefield. The ghost fleet of the Potomac is not just a relic of the First World War. It is a mirror, reflecting every war since, in which victory left behind more machinery than any nation quite knew what to do with. And in a strange, almost poetic twist, the very failure that created Mallows Bay is what ultimately preserved it. Had the salvage operation succeeded completely, had the ships been properly dismantled and hauled away, there would be nothing left to see today. No eagles nesting on wooden bows, no kayakers threading between century-old ribs, no accidental sanctuary teeming with life. The unfinished business of 1925 became the ecological gift of the 21st century. So the next time you hear about a nation racing to build an unstoppable arsenal, remember the quiet bend of the Potomac River, where hundreds of ships built for victory ended up as homes for eagles instead. Remember that history's greatest stories are not always written on battlefields. Sometimes they are written in the quiet aftermath, in the decisions nobody wanted to make, in the wreckage nobody planned to leave behind. What do you think? Should places like Mallows Bay be fully excavated and studied, or left exactly as they are, slowly returning to the earth? Let me know what you think in the comments below. If this story pulled you into a piece of history you never knew existed, make sure to like this video and subscribe, because there is another forgotten chapter waiting, another graveyard hiding just beneath the surface of what we think we already know.